Welcome to Coffee and Contemplation. I'm Heidi.
I'm Robin.
And today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, The Monster.
The show is called Coffee and Contemplation, and we literally haven't mentioned what beverages we've been drinking all this time. I am drinking a cup of Highlander grog, and that's from a local roaster here where we live, Dublin Roasters, and it's one of my favorites.
I am going with an old standby today, which is Lemon Lift. Black tea with lemon rind, I believe, and it is delightful. And now that we've acquired coffee, let's begin contemplation. We started a podcast, then the pandemic hit. There was like a long gap of several months. We said we're tired of waiting, so we figured out how to record remotely. And then we recorded, 3-4 episodes remotely?
Three.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then I actually found out that I was going to need to move. So we put the podcast on pause. We put recording on pause again. Then I ended up buying a house. And then Robin ended up moving in to be my tenant. So now we are recording face-to-face again. Now, the last time we recorded was like mid-October. So welcome to our lives, I guess.
Yeah.
But no, like for real, like so there's been some time. And I think that this show is not designed for you to go several months in between watching episodes.
Yeah.
It's designed to be watched, maybe not all in a row, although that's super fun, but it's definitely not designed for huge pauses in the middle. So like when we picked up the episode, I was like, wait, it took me a second. And then I was like, oh, right. Okay, I remember. But then I was like, why didn't she just go right back through the tree? Why are we running around? Like, you know.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Well, I wonder if like what they're implying through the flashbacks later is that she stepped on the branch, she saw it saw her, she screamed and took off and then hid.
Which is super fair.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And does make sense, like, in the context of what one would do.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing that, like, I remember through all of our conversations up to this point is that it has been very, very consistent in terms of, like, where, not just in terms of, like, well, we pick up where we left off, but, like, it's very cohesive. Like, even if there's a time jump, it's still like you can follow it pretty easily. So this was the first time that because I actually ended up watching this episode and started to take notes right after we recorded the last episode. So even though that was a long time ago, I actually did go into it like right after that. So I had the ending of episode 5 of Flea and the Acrobat like right there, and it was jarring even then.
Okay. One thing that I was really interested in and thought was super cool was the way that Jonathan and Nancy are able to hear each other. Because we do get a little bit of that between Joyce and Will, but this was interesting because they were literally just able to shout for each other and still hear each other. And it would be easy to be like, yeah, don't think about it for narrative convenience or whatever, but I'm wondering if there are some sort of mechanics that they have worked out between the here and the upside down, and like whether location or anything like that has something to do with it.
And also the fact that there is an open gate near them as well. Like, that doesn't really happen with Joyce and Will.
That's fair, yeah, because Will's able to communicate through the phone and through the wall. Like, it's almost an open gate, but if it was actually open, Will would have come right through. And, I mean, like, we know Joyce would have pulled Will right through if there was actually a way to do that.
Yeah. And speaking of that, one thing that caught my attention was that when Nancy does find the opening again, the piece of music that they use for that section is the same piece of music from when the boys meet Elle at the end of episode 1. The track is called No Weapons, because I recognized it right away. And I kind of went, I wonder if there's any significance there, or if that's just because it sounded good there. I don't know, like, it was an interesting connection. And it does sound good, so. And from there, the gate closes, and that's the end of the cold open.
Yeah.
It's a very short, it's short compared to the one that's coming. So yeah, and from there, we catch up with Steve along with Tommy and Carol for some reason, who are driving out to the Wheelers' house. I mean, maybe in hopes that they can all go out after he clears things up with Nancy, but I'm like, why are they there?
Yeah, I think he's with Tommy and Carol because it's in the script. Like, if I was at the place of actually stopping by somebody's house because I was worried about them. I mean, first of all, in the 21st century, like, that's a big step. But second, like, I definitely wouldn't say, let me take two of my superficial friends, have them come with me in this moment when I'm actually feeling really vulnerable. Like,
Not only are they there, but I'm a little confused about his reaction to them teasing him about, like, oh, Steve has a heart, and oh, Steve's in love. Like, we have discussed ad nauseum how much we dislike Tommy and Carol.
sure.
So let's be clear about that, because actually, like, when Carol says the thing about, well, no one would ever blow off King Steve, like, she's kind of got a point. And also, like, you know, them going, oh, Steve has a, like, why does that bother him? But even them teasing him doesn't seem that bad, especially in contrast.
I mean, of all of the teasing and bullshittery that they have shown up to this point, them being like, "Aw, you're worried about her," and "Aw, you really like this girl," it's like harmless, you know. I think probably he just is feeling vulnerable and doesn't want to be called out about it.
Maybe Steve knows that if he lets them see that then they'll make it worse later, which then, like, but then why are they there? Like, it's just a very odd setup. Like, I don't...
He's there because he's feeling insecure. He's prickly because he's feeling insecure.
And, I mean, to Steve's credit, in this moment, he's not wrong. There is something wrong, and Nancy is worried about something bigger than what she's letting on.
Oh, yeah.
And from there, we catch up with Hopper and Joyce, who have been discussing Hopper's findings at the lab.
This transition was a little bit jarring for me because it seemed like, you know, we had the super intense cold open that really was high octane because of the stakes and Nancy, like, nearly dying. And then you had the high emotional stakes of Steve seeing Jonathan and Nancy together. And then it just kind of slowed down almost a little bit too much. And also, again, because of the gap between the time that I watched the last episode and this episode. But I think that the energy just, like, plummets. Joyce and Hopper just, like, sitting at the kitchen table and him just being like, Joyce, I don't want to talk about this anymore. But it is a very effective scene. You know, I absolutely loved Joyce, like, slamming the drawing down and being like, it wasn't Will.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that, too, is also that she doesn't, like, sink into despair right there.
I wouldn't lose this scene, but it feels weird.
I think it probably ends up being a directing thing. I think the answer would be to make them a little more frustrated with each other, so that his energy is matching hers. Like, I've told you all this already. You know, let's figure out some way to be of more action, which feels more in line with Hopper's character anyway. It's funny, though, because that scene doesn't bother me. In fact, I think because of the nature of the sequence we just watched, like, it does feel like a little bit of a cool down after that. This is the first occasion when Hopper is beginning to understand that Elle even exists. And that's just so bittersweet, maybe, you know, given everything that's to come. Like, really the earliest stage of, like, their beginning. We pivot at that point back to Nancy and Jonathan. In the shower, Nancy is reliving what just happened. I really like their use of flashback right there. I think it's a very effective use of that tool. They both agree that they don't want to be alone. Nancy asks Jonathan to come up into the bed.
I loved the way that he rolled out the sleeping bag. You know, when she came back in, almost had this moment of like, oh shit, does she actually, like, want to be by herself? Like, does she want me to go? And then he offered to leave, and I think it was a sincere offer. He understood immediately what she meant by, can you come up here? I have no idea if it was direction or if this was, you know, an actor thing or what, but that he turns towards her, but does not reach out to touch her, was, I think, really skillfully done.
You know, you can see romance building here, but it's not in a sexual way. And I really appreciate that, because I think that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
It's moments like that make some of the other scenes so frustrating.
Yeah.
I think. Moving on. Mike is also having
a difficult day.
A bit of distress. He destroys Elle's fort. From there, then we pivot back to Hopper and Joyce. Hopper's making a call on a payphone, and he and Joyce are off somewhere.
Adventure.
And that actually made me think of some of the stuff that we see between them in season 3, and how, you know, when he says, maybe you should consider working for me, they do make a really good team. Like, this is some of the calmest,
right,
you know, we've seen her. particularly like later when they get to the Ives home and she says, this is my son. And you can tell there's still some of that like urgency there, but she's able to contain it and focus it. And I'm like, Hopper may have been onto something.
Yeah.
Even all this time, back.
Mm-hmm.
It made me appreciate that moment in season 3 more than I had already. Because that was actually something I really enjoyed about season 3. Nancy can't sleep, so she's fully engaged in research. And they start putting together this idea that Will and Barb are trapped.
I thought that scene was really interesting, really just in terms of almost like nostalgia and the way that they set up her doing research. Because these days she'd be sitting up in bed with a phone in her hand, looking at YouTube and Googling like bear hunting habits and so on. But I like the way that she like starts putting things together and starts trying to use concrete knowledge that she already has to understand this thing that is completely other. So she's like, okay, it's always by itself. It hunts at night. Every time we've seen it, it's been dark. I think it comes from this other place. I think it lives there. I think she's, using this sort of like determination and knowledge seeking as a coping mechanism, which is, I think, pretty easy to understand. Mm-hmm. And in this situation, like, kind of admirable, kind of cool.
In the midst of this brainstorm, though, Karen rattles the doorknob and Nancy's like, I'll be down in a minute.
I'm not sure what to do with that moment. I mean, Karen rattles the door and they grab each other's hand. Like, that's super sweet. And I even like that, Jonathan turns around and is like, your mom doesn't knock? Like, that was cute. But, like, why didn't Nancy just go downstairs and get herself some pancakes? Like, did she not think that her mom was going to, like, come back and check on her?
That's true.
Like, why did they both have to sneak out the window? I don't get that. I don't get why leave the door locked and turn the music on as a distraction and not put the sleeping bag away.
Why not just have Jonathan sneak out? Mm-hmm. You go downstairs like normal.
And then just like, he can wait for you at the hardware store or something.
Yeah, it's very strange. Mr. Clark, meanwhile, gets a visit from the lady from the lab.
I thought Mr. Clark was not long for this world. I thought that personage was going to kill him. And I was not happy. It's funny, like, there's two sort of shots in this episode that make you think, like, something super dire either has happened or is going to happen, but then that ends up not being the case. And it's kind of cool. So, like, the one is this one where that agent shows up at Mr. Clark's house. And then the other one with Eleven and Dr. Brenner, when he comes into her cell and offers her the flower and the whole thing of, like, today's the day we make contact. But, like, the scene opens with the door opening and she, like, tenses up. I was like, oh God, did they catch her and force her back to the lab or something like that? And then you immediately find out that's not the case. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's, like, any further to go with that, but it's just interesting.
It's, like, almost a jump scare, but not. Mm-hmm. And this season in particular does a really good job of building suspense. And I think when it succeeds in that, the best is when you have these moments that nothing actually bad happens, like, in that particular moment, but you have all this reason to believe that it will because there is something sinister happening on, like, more of a subtext level. Mm-hmm. Like, you have, so for example, that this woman is not there for the reason that she says she's there.
Right.
And while, no, she may not end up harming Mr. Clark, they are trying to find the boys, and they are trying to find Eleven, imprison her, possibly imprison the boys too. They wanted to clean up Will's disappearance and made it seem like he died. So what were they going to do with Mike, Dustin, and Lucas? I think if they had given her, like, even more to do, I mean, in compliments to the actress, because she's not in this series very much, but, like, she has a Dolores Umbridge sort of vibe to me.
Yeah.
Especially because she's reporting to Brenner. Like, it has a Umbridge and Fudge kind of vibe.
Yeah.
But yeah, she talks to Mr. Clark, and with this clearly fake club program for the boys. And then speaking of the boys, Mike vents to Dustin, who talks some sense into Mike. And after our discussion last time, and after a lot of the way we've been analyzing kind of the dynamics in this group, like particularly among the boys, I really love that Dustin calls them all out, including Eleven. Mm-hmm. Like, it's like everyone was freaking out for their own reasons. And I just really love Dustin's level-headedness. Like, all right, I've been trying to appease everybody for long enough. Because he has. He's been, like, trying to kind of keep the peace and, like, wait, everybody, just can't we all get along? He's like, all right, no, stop it. You all were being assholes. Like, you know, so this is what we're gonna do. We've made a lot of references before about how, like, well, Mike's the DM and Dustin's the bard and everything. And it's like, but I don't think that that's necessarily always true. Like, Mike is sort of the de facto, like, little leader, but I like that in a moment like this, Dustin can be like, you're relieved of your position as leader. I'm calling the shots right now.
Yeah.
We need to clear the air first. But also, you need to just stop on your tirade.
Yeah.
Let's find 11, and then once we're all back on the same team, then we can find Will.
Dustin is definitely the one that is, like, the most emotionally mature, at least in this stage of the series, among all the kids, definitely. As much as I love Elle, she's certainly not as emotionally mature as Dustin, for reasons that are entirely outside of her control.
Not to no fault of her own, yeah.
And Dustin has a really great point when he says to Mike, like, sometimes your obliviousness is just totally out of control.
Oh, when they're on the bikes later, yeah.
I love Dustin.
When Mike offers his hand for the I Drew First Blood, Lucas has to consider it. He counteroffers on the condition that they forget about Elle and go straight to the gate, and he insists that Elle is not one of the party. Dustin reminds them of the importance of sticking together. And I actually like that they don't resolve the conflict here. I remember expecting them to the first time I saw it, and being impressed that they didn't, because it would have been too easy. And plus, Eleven's not there, and she was part of that. And I feel that that's a key factor in when they do resolve the conflict. It completely feels earned. It completely feels real. It wouldn't have felt earned here, right. I don't think. Because they're both Mike and Lucas are still both too fixated on their opinions. They wouldn't have had any reason to change their minds yet, you know. And Dustin's perspective doesn't work for either of them, so they just stay divided, and off Lucas goes by himself.
Yeah, I do love Dustin's speech though, and like the thing about the trolls, and like Gaten Matarazzo's delivery of the line, "And we were all disabled."
Yeah.
It's just like, I love it so much.
Yeah. And what I love is that, like, yeah, it's like through this lens of D&D, but it's completely valid.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's like and it, like, literally, that's what happens in the beginning of the next episode. They're all separated, and it's only once they, you know, kind of team back up that that's when they work best. But while Lucas goes off to find the gate, Elle decides to rob the grocery store, which is intercut with another flashback in the tank. There's sort of this echo between the flashback and then between Jonathan and Nancy, that there's this repeated line of, it can't get us, it can't get you in here. You know, it made me think of Nancy's response of, we don't know that. And neither does Brenner. Yeah. It's just this assumption. And to have Nancy have already said that beforehand, it's kind of like, haha, we know that it eventually gets out. You know, hubris is what I'm saying. When Hopper and Joyce arrive at Terry Ives' house, they talk to Becky. I'm kind of surprised that Becky doesn't, like, give them some kind of heads up beforehand.
She says the thing about, like, you're 5 years too late if you want her to tell you anything, which tells you that, like, something is going on. But if I was the caretaker of someone who wasn't able to communicate and then some, like, random cop showed up to my door, I would be asking a lot more questions like, why do you want to speak to my sister? And who is this random person with you? And what is this about? And come back with a warrant, you know.
And I guess maybe the only reason she doesn't is because she knows Terry's not going to say anything.
I guess.
But
yeah.
This is one of those moments, too, when they do try to talk to Terry. I know they don't mean to, but it's like, it's one of those things that just... I find it frustrating partly because I know there's no way around it, but it's the idea of, like, knowing that when Elle shows up there next season, Terry is saying that loop of words, and it's like there's no way they can go back and change that. And so it's one of those inconsistencies you just have to go with.
Yeah.
She's not muttering, there's nothing happening. Lucas suits up. I know it's supposed to probably be a reference to Rambo, I'm guessing, but again, Ranger vibes, man. He notices the Hawkins electric guy, and then that's when we get the scene between Mike's obliviousness and how Lucas is jealous. And I really love the you can have more than one best friend concept. And I like that Mike says it in that conversation. It's a bit of an evasion, but it's also really sweet that he notices that Dustin is taking himself down in the middle of it. So Mike insists, but no, you are too. But I don't know if this is really a moment of empathy necessarily, but it's just that he's a compassionate and caring person.
Even if he is oblivious.
Yeah.
But he's also a preteen.
Yeah.
Like this kind of situation where you have a very close-knit group of friends and then there's a newcomer, whether that's a romantic interest or even like, you know, if it was a new neighbor or something, especially with somewhat young children, is going to throw everything into a little bit of chaos. That's totally normal. It's not a judgment on any of the kids. I think there's something to be said about some of the choices that are made in later seasons by these characters. Mm-hmm. But in this season, it feels very much like people who care about each other hurting each other's feelings without intending to. And Dustin just being like, if Yins don't hug, I swear to God, you know.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that, like, so here's a question. I find that, like, well, I do like this exchange, and I don't think that Dustin is wrong. I do think there is a level of jealousy that is in play here between Lucas and Mike. However, it's also the sense of, like, Lucas being genuinely like, but no, seriously, what about Will? Yeah. You're prioritizing someone else over Will. Mm-hmm. We thought he was dead. Well, he's gonna be dead if we don't do something. We have all the information now. What are you doing?
Yeah. Which is why I think Lucas is saying the things like, yeah, I agree. This is the party. Elle can clearly take care of herself, as she demonstrated, by kicking the shit out of me.
Lucas is not wrong, but he's not willing to see Mike's perspective, which is, yeah, but she is trying to help us.
Right.
She actually is on our side.
She's trying to protect us.
And you keep shoving her away.
Right.
Making it worse.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know if Mike actually has all of that quite put together. Mm-hmm. But that's where I think he's coming from. So I think that's a really well-written scene. Mm-hmm. I really like that a lot.
Yeah.
Again, like half that dialogue in the hands of other actors.
Even adult actors.
I was just gonna say, young and old. Like,
yeah.
These long speeches about friendship and camaraderie. It's like that stuff can get so cheesy so quickly. And I have to wonder if that's another scene that on paper probably doesn't look as effective as it ends up being in the show because of the nature of the actors delivering the performances. So This is the sequence where Hopper and Joyce talk to Becky, who sort of gives them the rundown of Terry's history with Brenner. How do you feel about this sequence?
There is some useful information, like the MK Ultra experiments included use of psychedelic drugs and sensory deprivation tanks. Terry didn't know she was pregnant at the time and that she supposedly miscarried, but believes that Jane still exists. A lot of that I feel like you could have just got from the newspaper. Hopper says to Joyce, she sued Brenner, she sued the government, those suits came to nothing. We know then that she thought she had a daughter. So I'm not actually sure that it needs to be there.
Yeah. I disagree, though. Them actually walking through it and seeing it, I think, is really important because I think the purpose that it serves is then seeing Joyce's response of, like, she's been at this for all this time. And I don't know that you could have accomplished that as successfully if they hadn't been there in that nursery. What's fascinating is I was actually going to say that I don't like the cutaways. I don't like the flashbacks because I don't think that you need them at all. The reason that I think that those flashbacks work so well with Nancy is because they're serving a function of showing you what she's thinking about. And it's showing you the brutality of, like, how these images are coming at her. No one in that nursery are thinking about 11. They don't know about 11.
Yeah.
Those are for us. Like, hey, this is what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. We would have been able to follow it without the cutaways. And especially if the scene had been shot as though there wouldn't be any, like slow push-ins or the editing done with a lot of coverage on Hopper rather than Becky, where, like, you're just hearing these words, like, over visuals. It seems out of place with a lot of the tone of the rest of the series. Mm-hmm. They use flashbacks similarly in a scene later and when I say later, I mean season 2, when they're explaining what's happening with Will and his possession, essentially. And I don't like it there either. I just think that the scene could have actually been a lot more compelling if they had shot it, like, more of the camera, like, doing more storytelling through the visuals. Mm-hmm. Like, in that room, in that nursery.
Yeah.
And maybe it was a thing of, like, it just wasn't feeling very compelling in the edit, and they were like, we need to give this more punch, and so that's why they did it. It's my belief that the scene would have been not just stronger, but it would have been more bittersweet and actually more chilling without the cutaways. Lucas walks the perimeter of the Hawkins lab, where the compass is pointing him. Jonathan and Nancy go out to the hunting store.
Nancy is talking about having gone shopping and like how she's spending her time and what she's invested in has changed so drastically. It's jarring to her. You know, just last week she was in this place that was like so materialistic and so superficial, and how she's like bonding with Jonathan. And it's not even that, like, there is a little bit of flirting that's going on, but mostly it's just kind of like they're just getting to know each other. And I like that Jonathan does kind of tease her, but in a very gentle, not like accusatory way. And he doesn't say anything shitty about Steve, and he doesn't say anything shitty about her liking to shop or anything like that. You know, all he says is like, well, what's weirder, the fact that you're buying a bear trap or the fact that you're hanging out with me? You know?
And she plays into that.
Yeah.
And kind of in the same vein, like she doesn't say anything directly bad about Steve either.
Right.
Which makes what happens next.
We've hit the scene.
So a guy calls out to Nancy about seeing her movie, and she finds the graffiti on the Hawk marquee. All the Right Moves, starring Nancy the Slut Wheeler. Nancy finds Steve and the bunch in the alley where Tommy is spray painting more. What Tommy is spray painting on the wall in the alley, I just never really read it before. I was so focused on the action of the characters that it's what it says is Byers is a perv as opposed to something more about Nancy. I think I just had always assumed that it was like either just a copy of what's out on the marquee or just something about
just nonsense. Yeah.
Nancy Wheeler's a slut or something like that.
Yeah. I think that this scene could have been really good with a few adjustments that are so minor that it's really a shame. Because if you just took away the spray painting aspect of it, like if they hadn't spray painted the marquee, and if Jonathan and Nancy had just run into Steve and the Scooby Gang just naturally, then you could literally have all of the same dialogue and the scene would work so much better. I wouldn't have the problems with the scene that I have because, first of all, any kind of conversation between Steve and Nancy about what Steve saw and the misunderstanding that he had and the trying to actually like reach each other and actually communicate with each other is completely blown away by the fact that he slut-shamed her in front of the entire town. Whether or not he was the one that actually spray-painted that message up there or not, and signs point to that it was actually Tommy who did it, Tommy would not know that there was some sort of issue between Steve and Nancy if Steve hadn't told him. And he was obviously there when Tommy did that shit and made no attempt to stop him. And Nancy has no way of knowing either way.
Yeah.
And when Nancy rocks up, Steve does not make any attempt to handle the situation in anything like an okay way.
Yeah, I mean, a phrase that we've heard a lot through 2020, in fact, is inaction is action.
Yeah.
So I would say that applies here.
Yeah. And why all of that bums me out, whoever was in charge of making this scene happen, whether it was the writing or, you know, the production or the duffers or like whoever, I don't think that the implications of doing something like that were fully thought through. How traumatic it would actually be to do something like that to Nancy is just, it's not addressed. It's not addressed in the scene. It's not addressed in later scenes. It's not addressed at any point ever. So that's why I feel like if you had just taken it out, then it wouldn't be such an issue.
I think part of the problem is they wanted to have Steve still do this really deplorable thing, but then they didn't want to leave it there. This was the last time we were going to see him. He's just a complete asshole. And, I mean, in that sense, it works. They wanted him to have done something really terrible to atone then for it later. When Jonathan and Nancy are out in their downtown, they run into that group, and Steve has his arm around some other girl. That would be my kind of script doctoring approach. And because that also feels like it's more like in line with what he thought Nancy did. Well, you're clearly seeing someone else. I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm really good at that.
The conversation between Steve and Nancy is actually really juicy and really interesting. It's super well acted. I like the exchange of words in the dialogue. Her saying, oh, you came by last night, and Carol in the background is like, ding, ding, ding. And neither one of them even looks at her. They just keep looking at each other. You can tell that Steve is very sincerely, very genuinely hurt by what he thinks happened. And I would say this even after he, like, turns his attention on Jonathan and starts, like, deliberately provoking Jonathan, which we'll get to.
Yeah. I think what they're going for is that he doesn't know how to express that hurt. Because, to Carol's point, no one would ever blow off King Steve.
Right.
You know, she's not wrong. I think this is the first time Steve has been in this position before. I think you said it's his first big boy relationship.
It's not about in that scene being like, I'm cooler than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than Jonathan, blah, blah, blah. He's just like, you fucking cheated on me, and I'm really bent out of shape about it. Like, you fucked up. You hurt me. That, I think, is like a really interesting and really cool scene that just gets like all of the wind taken out of its sails by the bookending of the slut-shaming, and second, Steve saying that he assumed that Jonathan was queer. So, like, by the misogyny and the homophobia, it completely fucks up the scene. Like, I totally get Steve provoking Jonathan, and honestly, I blame Steve or judge Steve less for being like, oh, no wonder, you know, something bad happened to your little brother. Like, it's horrible. I don't like it. I don't approve of it. It's not okay. But I think he's deliberately saying shit to piss Jonathan off because he wants Jonathan to hit him, so he has the excuse to hit Jonathan. That is literally what I think is happening. But he just, and again, I'm not cool with it, but like, I can still like Steve as a character, and I can still be engaged in this scene with that. But the Nancy the Slut Wheeler and I always thought you were a queer takes me. I'm gone. You completely lost me.
The first time that I watched this show, in the beginning of the episode, I remember that I felt a lot of empathy for Steve in the moment when he saw Nancy and Jonathan in the bedroom, because he kind of even has that like, right, this is like what I did before, and like, you know, it calls back to that moment of them in the bedroom, you know. So I had this moment because I was starting to go like, all right, maybe you're not so bad, because he is concerned and he knows that she's not telling him the truth, but he doesn't assume that she's lying to him in that she's cheating on him. He assumes that something's really wrong, and he's right.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking like, no, don't get the wrong idea. Like, oh man, oh, it's not what you think. This moment, I felt burned. And also like weirdly validation, because I was like, I knew it. I was so like, I was right. And it's really hard to let go of that. When I watch this scene in present viewing, it makes me call into question everything that follows, because you can't erase this. I know that this is probably not good or appropriate or whatever, but I almost feel like the stuff with Jonathan, the stuff that Steve says to Jonathan hits me, for whatever reason, it hits me harder. Almost because I feel like, to your point about like, they don't seem to understand the full ramifications of what that graffiti and what that public shaming is going to do to Nancy, in the same way that they don't understand the violation of privacy about the photos.
Right.
They feel very similar.
Yeah,
and so, but I think they understand completely the weight of what Steve says to Jonathan. And even in the way Heaton's body language, like the way he performs that, like when Steve pushes him, that's not what pisses Jonathan off.
Right.
It's when he brings up his family, Jonathan just stops.
Yeah.
You can see Heaton just stop. And so, but it's like you watch that change in him, like, okay, you can say all the shit you want about me, but it's like as soon as he brings up his brother, as soon as he brings up his mother, it's like, and I don't know if that's like if that's kind of like where my philosophy is. Like, you can shame me all you want, whatever. I don't know. I probably deserve it, but do not come after my family.
Well, I think that's true for many, 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 many people.
Sure.
You know, I mean, like my joke is that I am very small and look like a Care Bear, and you know, like you can say mean things to me all day. I might not like it. I might not like tolerate it, but I'm not gonna hurt you. But like, if you come into my house and like threaten my cats, they'll never find your body. You know, like. And, you know, and I feel very similarly about, like, you know, members of my family and members of, you know, and my friend circle and so on. So I think that's very, very common. What I think is interesting is he starts getting irritated when Steve brings up his dad, but he keeps going.
Speaking of Lonnie, though, I want to mention the Unspoiled podcast. Maggie said that she wondered if perhaps the reason Jonathan just absolutely takes Steve down, because I mean, Steve gets like one good hit in, and then
that's it.
Because I'll admit, the first time I saw it, I was surprised. I was like, whoa. Like, there's a level of like just uncontrollable rage, you know, but also like Jonathan seems to know what he's doing. I don't know that I would have thought about it in those terms, but her suggestion was that perhaps Jonathan and Lonnie may have gotten into it a few tussles before.
I'm not the least bit surprised.
Well, and, like, it explains a little bit about the first interaction we see between Jonathan and Lonnie. He pins him to a wall.
Yeah.
Now, granted, I think at the time that we talked about that moment, I said maybe it's because Cynthia went running out and said, there's some guy in our house. Like, he just came in. And so Lonnie's like, okay, bang. But then his line is, you've gotten stronger. How would he know that?
Yeah.
I mean, that seems very specific. So I think that headcanon holds up 100%.
I also think it's possible that Jonathan, having come from a less privileged family, from a less highly regarded family, it's entirely possible that he has gotten into, like, schoolyard scuffles and things like that. It just seems plausible that he would know how to fistfight more skillfully than Steve, who usually relies on his charisma, you know, to navigate social situations.
Yeah.
And usually has Tommy to rely on to fight his fights for him. And I was actually really surprised by how many times Tommy tried to intervene to end the fight. Like, he tried to jump in and hit Jonathan on Steve's behalf, and Steve pushes him away and says, I forget what the exact line is, but it's either like, stay out of this, or back off, or something like that. It's like, no, this is my fight, you know, like bro code or whatever. And, like, several times, once things really, really get out of control, he says cops like 20 times.
Yeah.
But also, he goes to Jonathan and says, he's had enough. He's had enough. And at that point, I actually have to say, to Tommy's credit, which is words that I never thought would leave my mouth, it's not a, I'm going to fight you. It's not even necessarily a, you hit my friend, therefore we have beef now. It's literally a, dude, you won this fight.
Yeah.
That's enough. We're done here.
I also think that's a Karate Kid reference. I think.
He's had enough?
Yeah.
Is it?
Well, I mean, maybe. I might be really grasping at straws, but it's what I thought of because of when they're beating up Daniel and the other friend says to Johnny, he's had enough. And I'll tell you when he's had enough. But
yeah, Tommy was like, okay, this is like,
you want that. I had not thought of that. That's a very powerful observation. I also don't think I caught Steve telling him no. I don't think I've ever, because I think every time I watch the sequence, I think I end up looking away, shaking my head so often towards the beginning. So
that's fair.
So I see and acknowledge what you just said. However, I'm gonna weirdly contradict it, except not. I'm yes-anding you, I guess. Because can we also acknowledge how horrendously unfair it is? Tommy has not been hit all 3 seasons. As far as we know, he's off living his best life. Steve, meanwhile, gets his face bashed in all 3 seasons. Gets interrogated by Russians. Probably has like 5 broken ribs, a detached retina, concussion, probably a bruised lung, but no, Tommy's just perfectly fine.
He does manage to assault a police officer, which I think is hilarious and adorable. You know?
Yeah. But it's like watching this now after having done the podcast and having taken these close readings. I just wonder, how does this sequence look in contrast, or I don't want to say contradict, but how does it stand in comparison and or contrast to the sequence where Steve breaks Jonathan's camera?
When I'm actually like thinking about my enjoyment of Stranger Things as a whole, my actual character analysis of the development of Jonathan and Steve and Nancy and their relationships with each other, I literally have to take these scenes out of the equation because they're too messy. I also have a problem with the way they gave Nancy absolutely nothing to do except stand there and say, no, don't, stop, you'll hurt him. Like...
Yeah.
Is this the same Nancy who was like swinging a bat around and perfectly able to fire a gun and like went toe to toe with the Demogorgon and lived to tell about it? I cannot deal with it. If I were Natalia Dyer, I'd be like, let's do a take where I literally get in the middle. It just feels more authentic to what she would do.
Well, or like she tries to get in the middle, but Tommy pulls her back, or Carol pulls her back, or something.
Happens.
Yeah. I mean, when she walks up, she smacks Steve.
Yeah.
And that's the whole, like, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. It's like, I actually really like that concept of like, he does something that he can't take back, but it's done from this place of I'm really hurt and I don't know how to deal with it. But what they had him do, it's like the scene with Lucas, they pushed it too far.
Yeah.
Cause yeah, I mean, I do. Every time I watch this scene, I'm like, nope, you don't come back from this. I'm glad that they did ultimately not have this be the last time we see him.
Yeah.
But I don't know when that happened in their writing process. They say that it happened as they were working on it. Well, at what point in the process? Was it like while they were shooting? Possibly. They're very vague about it. You know, in all of even the quotes that I have found, they're not very clear. So it makes me call into question how much I've bonded with this character and like, is that even okay?
Yeah. There's this assumption, or rather, I think I have to say there's this accusation that has really flooded pop culture analysis that any character you like is a reflection of your own worldviews, values, personality, what you find attractive in real life, the kind of relationship you would want in real life. And it's all patookies. Like, you know, it's garbage. You are allowed. It's fiction. I ended up doing like a lot of, you know, soul searching and like exploring and like reading different people's thoughts about this and like psychologists and like literature and film studies people, because of being very, very invested in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And I had to live my life and then casually be on Twitter and see that I'm a neo-Nazi because my favorite character is Ben Solo. And that is not accurate.
Yeah.
Do I want to be with a man who has murdered his father in order to like secure his magical powers of the dark? No, absolutely not. I would like a relationship with 0% patricide. So like all of this is to say that you are allowed to have any kind of parasocial relationship with Steve that feels right to you, and nobody gets to make you feel bad for that, including yourself.
I was just gonna say, well, I think part of it is also like as you move forward into the rest of the season, but then also particularly in season 2, I think they kind of want you to forget about this moment, or they just do. And I really wrestle with that sentiment. You don't come back from this. And that's something I don't think I'm ever going to have a clear answer on, at least for myself.
The thing that I have come to in reading all of these like disparate takes and everything is that it is something that is incredibly personal. And you may come to a point where you're like, you don't come back from that. I just disregard these two scenes and go on my merry way. And both of those are completely valid.
I will say that something that this does bring up, though, is the fact that, like, kind of like something you said about Nancy being punished for her thing.
Punished for having sex.
I think that they kind of punish Steve for the rest of the series. And so paradoxically, there's a rather large contingent of the fandom that like enjoys that and is like, no, he's got to get his face bashed in season 4 and whatever else because that's a tradition now. And I'm like, and that I find really upsetting because I'm like, why are we rooting for this person to just get beaten into a pulp again and again and again? And I'm kind of all over the place, but to close all of that out, the cops come, Jonathan gets arrested, and everyone else gets away. And Nancy is left with her head in her hands. So, back over with Joyce and Hopper. Hopper insists that they will find Will. Joyce is less optimistic. And then they get the radio signal that Jonathan's been arrested. I don't know why I get such enjoyment out of that. Like, you haven't seen Joyce, have you? When she's right there. I don't know why. Like, it's really, I don't know. I enjoy that beat. At the police station, Nancy asks about when Jonathan will be released. And Flo makes Nancy think Jonathan has a thing for her. And that's why he did what he did, and I really don't like this.
Weirdly, I do like it, even though I think she's wrong, because I think at this point it's pretty obvious to everybody but Nancy that Jonathan is carrying a torch for her. And I think the function of her saying that is to kind of force Nancy not acknowledge that or accept it, but it's like to force her to acknowledge the possibility that maybe Jonathan is into her. Because what I really like is that Jonathan has been arrested. He's sitting in the police station with his hands in handcuffs, his face kind of a mess. She brings him ice, and then what does he say to her when she sits down? Is everything okay? You know, like, and she has this look on her face like, oh shit, you know,
That's fair. I guess I don't like it because it weirdly feels like it invalidates actually why he did it. And maybe that's just because I'm sensitive to that, because it's like, no, that was about his family and his mom and his brother.
Which is true.
And it's like, we have all been through enough, you know, and it is cruel. And so I don't disagree with you exactly. I'm just like,
I wish that they had come up with a different way for her to get there, rather than he beat up the guy who insulted his family because he loves you. That just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, because that's the thing. Like, in a way, I mean, I it's not that I mind the idea of making that connection. It's more that I don't like that then the fact that it's about his family goes unacknowledged.
Yeah, it's discordant.
But I still love Flo. Don't worry. Elle, however, loves Eggos and goes through several boxes of them.
Which is understandable.
We swing back over to Mike and Dustin, who run into their bullies. Meanwhile, Lucas is realizing that the lab is the source. It's where the gate is, and sees the Hawkins electric vans.
Which, like, I really have to give a lot of credit to Lucas's intelligence, because he, like, puts it together. And I don't mean that in a, like, it's unbelievable way. It's totally believable. Lucas is just really clever.
Yeah, and, like, I think we really see the final pieces of that click into place in the next episode.
True.
But he's like, something's screwy here. Like, what's going on?
And, like, him finding a tree and, you know, finding a good vantage point, like...
He's a ranger, I'm telling you. He had a really good perception roll. Mike and Dustin arrive at the quarry, that overlook, and they get trapped there. Troy gets a hold of Dustin, threatens to cut him. The other bully doesn't look okay with the threat of making Mike jump. Dustin tries...
To certain death.
Yep. Dustin tries to get Mike not to make the jump. Mike jumps anyway. And knowing what happens doesn't make this any less terrifying. Like, I'm not a person who is afraid of heights, but every time I see that shot of looking straight down and the rock, like, tumbling off the edge, like, I know it's fake, I know that that's a cliche, but it works here. It works for me. Like, it doesn't, and I think it's precisely because you're aware of what the stakes are, and you know that Mike is aware of what the stakes are.
Yeah. You know, the whole exchange between Mike and Dustin and the bullies, I almost feel like it doesn't work, but in other ways it really, really does. I don't know that I buy the knife. Only because they're so young. Now, is that necessarily fair? I don't know. All of the bullying that had happened up to that point was very childhood bullying, whereas the knife being introduced really, really takes it to another level. And also, like, forcing Mike to jump takes it to another level, because it's payback for what Elle did to him. And the other thing is, like, I don't know that I can fully justify me saying I don't know that I buy the knife, because these are kids who obviously have no problem with physical intimidation and, at the very least, the threat of violence.
Yeah.
So these are not tender, gentle children. But at the same time, it's just a lot. I think it's super plausible that those two bullies would be young and dumb enough to not realize that that is a certain death sentence. In the same way that, like, you know, Callahan was like, so-and-so got drunk and dove off of here for $10, and Harper was like, no, he didn't. So, yeah, the knife just seems extra.
But maybe he doesn't actually really intend to use it. I've heard stories of school shootings where kids bring a gun to school, and I'm not saying this is indicative of every school shooting, far from it, but I have heard of specific instances where it's an intimidation technique only, but then something happens, and then either accidentally or, like, fine then, and then it's like it happens because things escalated so quickly, and suddenly it's like, and their whole life is ruined. I mean, we even said, like, the fact that Elle intervenes, she actually, not only does she save Mike, she also kind of saves Troy. He would have killed Mike, indirectly killed him. And I mean, it all works for me. The knife doesn't bother me. But I wonder if maybe that's, like, what you're picking up on. Like, they went for kind of this idea. Maybe there's not enough textual evidence to think that he would level up that quickly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't know, to me that kind of works, because sometimes it's like, that is how it happens sometimes. It's like, whoa, I didn't know you were there yet, kind of thing. And it ends up being this kind of bizarre parallel between what's going on in this group and what's going on, you know, over with the teenagers. Like, it just ends up, I don't think there's any, like, direct parallel, but it's just kind of curious that there's kind of a bullying vibe going on there as well. So it's just kind of the two of these things happening kind of at the same time is just kind of curious. But yes, Mike doesn't die because he's levitated back up, and the CGI of the sequence is
what it is.
The Duffers and Sean Levy actually agree with that. From the book, Worlds Turned Upside Down, it says, for the Duffers, the visual effects intensive sequence shot at Atlanta's Bellwood Quarry proved to be one of the season's most challenging. Quote, it was really difficult to move around there, Matt Duffer says. Quote, it was really hard to get equipment there. By the time we got all set up, I think we had 5 hours with our kids. We didn't really know what we were doing as far as digital effects were concerned. I remember feeling very lost when we were shooting this. Quote, we had to make it look like Mike was really teetering on the edge there, and when we had him falling as well, add cinematographer Ives. Crew had been striving to reveal elements of the story with extensive camera work in earlier scenes such as the 360-degree turn inside Hopper's trailer. But the quarry offered a chance to go even further technically. A 50-foot techno crane was set up to capture the most arresting angles. Quote, there were screen elements where we had Finn Wolfhard in a harness on a green screen, falling towards camera, falling laterally, going back up. And then we had to fly him over our camera. The rock that he steps off was at that location, but it was off to the side with a pad underneath. We were just underneath looking up at him, end quote. Ultimately, though, the camaraderie among the cast came through on screen. Quote, the group hug at the end, that's what people remember, Matt Duffer says. Not the shaky-looking green screen, even though it still bothers me, end quote. So I thought that was kind of interesting too, because it's like, yeah, the green screen's not great, but I remember the first time watching it, I'm like, oh, Elle found them.
Elle! Yeah. I mean, every time I see that group hug, I just I love that scene. I love it so much that it's after an episode in which a lot of emotionally rough stuff happens.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's just really nice to see this moment of happiness and friendship and relief, and even Dustin's little pat, pat, it's so cute. That's great.
And I think that it's so important that you have this moment of self, not even self-realization, but that Elle says, I'm the monster. I am. I freaked out when Lucas said it because I'm afraid that he was right. And because she believes that he's right. Mm-hmm. And so you need this moment, and you need just for the resolution that comes at the beginning of the next episode, you need to have Mike say, no, you saved me. You're not a monster. That's just such a big deal. I love that. But she needs to, it's not even just she needs him to say that. It's more she has to say it for herself. She has to come to terms with that and get it out in the open. A lot of the criticism that season 2 receives as a whole is that it basically copies a lot of season 1. In this moment, this made me think, this is why her closing the gate at the end of season 2 is so important, because she needs to do it for herself. Even if her assertion of I can, even if she doesn't know it beyond a shadow of a doubt, her telling that to Hopper is this is also something I have to do it. She doesn't say that in so many words, but it's she's been carrying this guilt since before she even escaped the lab. So she's our friend and she's crazy.
Oh my God, that speech.
Yeah, the whole sequence is just really rewarding. We see Elle open the gate in the flashback. I like that in season 2, that moment where Elle comes back and you get the hug between her and Lucas and Dustin is so great, because Lucas isn't here for this one.
Yeah.
So it's rewarding because you're oh, he gets to be there for that one. That's awesome! They're on their way back to the Wheeler's house, and the guy from the lab in the one van spots them, and he reports back that he has eyes on them, and a squadron of vans leaves the lab after arming up. And it kind of weirdly reminded me of that shot from Fellowship of the Ring where the Nazgul leave Minas Morgul, a little bit. Lucas sees this, and the episode ends. I really find this moment so hard to not just go straight into the next episode.
I would say this is very, very much an episode that was designed for binge watching. You come right in and then cancel your plans because you're not stopping now kind of deal.
The music does a lot of the heavy lifting there, which ironically is actually a track we have heard before. But the only other time I recall feeling this much of wanting to continue was at the end of episode 2, which was right after Barb was taken. Because I remember that in that episode as well being no, don't be over. And that's what it is. I don't want it to be over yet. I don't want the episode to be over yet. I actually think that this is an episode that gets, again, not worse, but it gets harder to not continue once you know what is coming.
Right.
This transition into episode 7 is really rewarding on multiple rewatches because you know the van flip is coming. And that whole sequence is like, it's pretty awesome. We'll get into the details of why next episode, but it's a really, really good transition. And like, you said, yeah, but when I said when you don't know what's coming, it's maybe not as compelling, and you said, yeah, but something's coming.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just listen to the music. Something's up.
Well, and like the vans are all on their way, and so overall thoughts.
There is a bunch of really interesting, compelling, and valuable character work done in this episode. As we discussed, some of the scenes are just real clunky. I think there are some things that weren't thought through, but it also advances the plot really well. Like, we start to make the connection between MK Ultra and what Brenner is trying to do with 11, and maybe why 11 has some of these powers, and we start to see some of the dissipation of the dramatic irony. Like, there are things that we've known this whole time, and the characters are finally, like, cottoning on and that kind of thing. So, overall, I quite like the episode.
I do too. This episode has some of the highest highs of the whole season, and possibly the whole series. I mean, the she's our friend and she's crazy. Not specifically just him shouting that, but like the return of the hero, and Elle getting to have this like absolute moment of complete and total badassery, followed by this moment of such vulnerability. And that's a scene that I look forward to. Like, that's one of those scenes where, like, when you think of Stranger Things, that's one of the ones I go to, and that's one of the ones I always look forward to. I'm always like really eager to watch, whenever I watch that sequence, it always leaves me with a smile on my face. Well, I'm not as bothered, I think, by the expository stuff, in Joyce and Hopper's group. The exposition that was delivered in Flea and the Acrobat about the theory of the Flea and the Acrobat, which I did look up after we did that episode, and it is absolutely a real theory, the more you know. That was a lot more compelling, and I think that, like, the stuff with Joyce and Hopper at this point is still kind of that, like, sort of investigative thriller, and we haven't really seen the genres coalesce just yet, but you can tell we're starting to get closer.
Yeah.
We're building towards resolutions across the board. There's so much great platonic stuff in this episode. Platonic friendships, platonic relationships. There's just so much good here. It's such a bummer that... And it's not like... I know you're not supposed to like the scene in the alley. I'm aware of that. It's just... It does, I think, too good a job at being upsetting, It's just unfortunate. And so overall, I think I really like this episode, apart from that one sequence. I think generally speaking, I actually really this is probably one of my favorites. I get a lot out of it. I cannot wait to continue. I can't wait till episode 8. It's gonna be great.
This concludes our contemplations on Chapter 6, The Monster. Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
Over and out. Make you think that, something...
Oh, sorry. Oh no.
Podcaster foul.
Yeah. Forgot to turn my phone off. Well, there's our outtake for the end of the episode.